Welcome back, my friend, to the second module and the second mind game of this program called the reverse thinking game. And before we jump into the details and purpose of the reverse thinking mind game, let me start with this preamble that will set you up nicely for the strategy that you are about to learn and master. And with this preamble, I'm going to discuss the phrase and topic of trading outcomes. By trading outcomes, I mean that we take the negative parts, the negative results of our life, and we then trade them for positive results. And for that, we need to discuss the ego. You see, we all have this pesky little thing called the ego. The ego is the drama queen, the petty tyrannist, the drill sergeant, the spoilt brat, the selfishness, the self-importance, the antagonist, the reactionary, and the self-absorbed part of who we are, that likes to think it's my way or the highway. Self-centered around the concept of me, the ego is always thinking in terms of, what about me? How does this affect me? How does this help me? What has this got to do with me? And why are they doing this to me? That's right, the ego is all about me. The ego does live in this small and exclusive world of me. The egoic part of who we are is always poised to defend, confront, critique, and attack even anything and anyone that threatens our security, comfort, identity, and perspective. The willful determination of the headstrong ego will never concede that its views are wrong, even when those views lead to undesirable outcomes that can result from its own erroneous thinking. And I know that just like me, you are prone to errors as a result of how you think. The egoic part of us is the harbinger of error, upset, loss, and pain. In fact, there is no greater threat to your joy and peace than the problematic ego. Its self-gratifying drive to get you what you always desire, and with its need to always be right, will take you deeper into the sinful plights of envy, gluttony, greed, lust, pride, sloth, and wrath. The materialistic ego, with its penchant for consumption, will take you further away from your true nature. The righteous ego, with its need to be right, will take you further apart from the people you love. The headstrong ego, with its unrelenting drive to have and do, will take you deeper into a life of stress and misery. That's because the ego will always want more of having life its way, and where the end justifies the means. When blindsided with unhealthy desire, the ego adopts the most extreme method and easiest route in which to satisfy its desires, where there is zero consideration for the medium to long-term ramifications of its actions, without prudence, without considering the downsides, without thinking about how one thinks, speaks, and acts affects one's closest relationships. Those unhealthy desires of the ego that drive to be right, to be first, to be pleasured, to be heard, to be spiteful, and to be controlling will almost always lead to undesirable outcomes. Undesirable outcomes do stem from unhealthy desires. Our unhealthy desires are driven by the egoic sins of envy, gluttony, greed, lust, pride, sloth, and wrath, where the self-gratifying desires of the egoic me is always thinking about how fast, how much, how good, and how often can I get what I want. And nobody is immune to the ego. Every morning that we wake up, the ego wakes up with us and immediately starts to think about how it's going to satisfy the desires of me. We experience our egoic desires as powerful thought forms. Thought forms have strong emotional charges. Thought forms also precede behavior, where one thinks and therefore one is reactively triggered and swept off in the direction of those thoughts. Therefore, if we can't control our egoic thoughts, then we are likely to experience more undesirable outcomes than not. So from the sound principle that thought precedes the behavior that manifests the outcome, it makes sense that what we think is the cause and effect of what we manifest. Again, we do manifest experiences that correlates with the way that we think. So let me ask you, what type of regular experiences and situations in your life do your thoughts manifest? Does what you think manifest your ideal emotions, great relationships, physical welfare and financial security, etc., or not? Give those questions some serious thought, because if you don't seriously contemplate the correlation between your thoughts and their subsequent outcomes, then your entire life is being choreographed by your thoughts and without you giving them any further thought. For better or worse, most people do unconsciously go along with whatever their thoughts suggest, even when those thoughts suggest that they engage with bad habits, even when those thoughts suggest that they self-sabotage or self-abuse, even when those thoughts suggest they respond to a loved one with spite and resentment, even when those thoughts suggest that they should be in a bad mood and feel terrible. If that's the case, then clearly the ego has got some stinking thinking going on. So in this mind game, the reverse thinking game, you will define the exact type of stinking thinking that leads you to manifest the undesirable outcomes in your life, namely the undesirable outcomes of bad habits, harmful situations, and negative emotions, whereby you keep reacting to something or someone in the same way, and this leads to the same undesirable outcome. Furthermore, when you take responsibility for the way that you respond to situations, you then soon realize that those problematic situations in your life that lead to those undesirable outcomes that keep showing up in your life are indeed affirmed, provoked, and sustained by the type of thinking that you associate them. So, with me in this tutorial, you will learn the simple and yet powerful mind game called reverse thinking. The playing rule of this game is straightforward. You reverse undesirable outcomes for desirable outcomes by reversing the conditioned response, what you think, that you have towards something or someone. In other words, you are reversing the way that you think to reverse the conditioned response that you have towards life situations in order to create a better outcome. Does that make sense? Good. With the reverse thinking game, you will learn to reverse your usual faults to avert the usual errors, upsets, losses, and pains that result from your usual response to the typical situations in your life. With reverse thinking, you will convert those problematic situations into the solution of a desirable outcome. By mastering the reverse thinking game, you'll transition from being a problem revolver to being the solution evolver, expanding from the little world of me into the larger world of we, where you abandon the self-serving and self-preserving finite game of the ego to instead play the all-inclusive and all-beneficial infinite game of the spirit, where everyone gets what they want together and forever. Think about it. If you are continually getting negative results in a particular area of your life, then to remove that outcome, you must simply think the opposite way towards it. In fact, the more you reverse the way you think, the more you will turn your entire life around. And you can start mastering the reverse thinking game with me right now in this video, and as outlined in the 5-step procedure that now follows. So let's both begin with this mind game strategy. The first step is to identify undesirable outcomes in your life. So with this first step, you will identify with the undesirable outcomes that have become reoccurring problems in your life. And these would be the bad habits, the harmful situations, and negative emotions that you keep experiencing because you are triggered by the stimulus of something or someone. To identify what these are for you, it will be helpful for you to refer back to your psychoanalysis work that you have undertaken with the previous resolution game. It will be helpful for you to review the undesirable outcomes of each archetype. So let's get started. Now open up a fresh page in your journal and mark down today's date. Now write the headline, Reverse Thinking Rehearsals, followed with a subtitle, Identify Undesirable Outcomes. Now I want you to identify and describe in detail at least 5 undesirable outcomes that regularly occur in your life. It could be a relational dispute with your friend, family member, employee or employer. It could be that you are in a poor financial situation, either living beyond your means or not having enough means. It could be that certain situations elicit distressing emotions for you. It could be that you can't start a new business venture or activity because of self-doubt and uncertainty. Just identify where you continue to experience the same undesirable outcomes in your life that are causing you stress, anxiety, frustration, or misery. Pause this tutorial right now and identify those 5 undesirable outcomes. Write them down and then come back to me for step 2. In this second step, I want you to establish the conditioned responses that you have attached to each undesirable outcome. So what does that actually mean and what does that entail? Well, let me first preface that discussion with this. From time to time, we all fall into the trap of outsourcing the solution to our problems. We do this with outward thinking, like, if I can just get them to change their ways. If only this situation was different, and I will wait until that happens and then it will be okay. But rarely and randomly does outsourcing the solution to our problems work. When expecting a situation to change on its own accord, we are in the powerless state of waiting for things to happen. Whilst waiting for the problem to change or cease, we can never be the one that takes the initiative to implement the solution. Outward thinking is based upon the idea of it's because of them or that out there, which is the reason why I think and feel like this. And this works on the principle of as without, so within, which is to say that how we experience life is being determined by the object of our experience. Not only that, the problem-orientated mind will always have a conditioned response that affirms, provokes, and sustains the problematic situation that we see out there. We do remain attached to our problems out there by pointing the finger of outward blame. When we say it's because of them or that, we are also saying it is not because of us. Outward blame does come from a victim's mentality. Outward blame is the way that we absolve ourselves from taking responsibility. If we were to take responsibility for what we think, say, and behave, and instead tackle our problematic situations out there with a solution-orientated mind, we can then adopt a victor's mentality and take the initiative to flip those problems into solutions, trading those undesirable outcomes for desirable outcomes, which leads us onto the subject of the conditioned response. Every problematic situation out there can be traced back to a conditioned response that we have. We are conditioned to respond in a certain way to a certain situational stimulus. Our problematic situations are affirmed, provoked, and sustained by the conditioned responses that we have towards those situations. The conditioned response is self-centered on the premise of, what about me? The egoic me is narrow-minded, biased, and with zero tolerance for the objective facts of reality and averse to alternative viewpoints. The ego's response is to always be defensive, offensive, or evasive towards and away from anything or anyone that threatens the desires of me. Where the knee-jerk response is to reject, avoid, deny, escape, or attack the object of its grievance, which results in the undesirable outcome of error, upset, loss, or pain. Therefore, to reverse those undesirable outcomes in your life, you must reverse the conditioned response that you have to those problematic situations so that you elicit a new conditioned response. You need to intercept your thoughts at the point of the original conditioned response and then reverse it for a better outcome. To find out what your conditioned responses are to the undesired outcomes that you have already identified in step 1, you can connect the dots looking back to establish the conditioned response with the following reverse sequence. So you start with the undesirable outcome. You have identified the bad habit, harmful situation, or negative emotions that keep showing up in your life, where there is some type of consequential upset, loss, and pain that's being caused to you or those that you care about. And you have already identified this from step 1. Then you would identify the stinking thinking that you have associated to the undesirable outcome, which are usually the expectations, justifications, blames, and excuses that you keep using to defend and preserve the view and position that you have in relation to the undesirable outcome that keeps showing up in your life, which leads us on to the conditioned response. The conditioned response is when you have responded in a way that is predetermined, which means when this something happens, I will think, express, and behave this way. Alternatively, undesirable outcomes can be reverse engineered back to establish the conditioned response by replaying the memory of a recent problem in your life that resulted in that undesirable outcome. Inside your mind's eye, you replay the scenario back from the finish to the start and review the interacting dialogue, seeing what you see, hearing what you heard, responding how you responded, thinking exactly how you thought, and then make a note of the entire thought process. So now that you have established how a conditioned response is a trigger point that leads to an undesirable outcome in your life, you can establish what the conditioned responses are to the undesirable outcomes that you have identified in step 1. So pause this video and now write in your journal the subtitle, Establish Conditioned Response. Now using the trace back methods that I've just shared with you, identify the conditioned responses to each of the undesirable outcomes that you have already established. And please note that it does require good detective work to closely examine your thought process. So do take your time with this step, and it will be time worthwhile spent, because in the examination of your thought processes as they relate to the outcomes in your life, you will start to establish the cause and effect correlation between what you think and what happens. You will begin to see how your thinking is shaping your reality. You will also bolster your self-awareness and strengthen your mindfulness skills, giving you more clarity and control over your mind. So again, establish the 5 conditioned responses that lead to the 5 undesirable outcomes that you have already identified in step 1. Identify them exactly as you think them inside your mind and write the thoughts down. Describe the thoughts as you think them. When you have established the conditioned responses, then move on to the 3rd step. In this 3rd step, you will create dynamic responses to counteract the conditioned responses that you have identified in the previous step. And what exactly are dynamic responses? Dynamic responses are ego-less and self-less. Dynamic responses are solution-orientated towards playing the infinite game of we. Dynamic responses are open-minded, inquisitive, and forward-thinking in nature. Dynamic responses are without personal motives and feelings attached. Dynamic responses have the qualities of virtue and inspiration. A dynamic response will be how you reverse think your conditioned responses. So together, let's explore some basic examples of how we can utilize a dynamic response to reverse think a conditioned response. So for example, imagine there is a recurring interaction within a close relationship, be it with a lover, sibling, or friend. And this recurring interaction always ends up with a heated dispute where you both get upset and are left dealing with the undesirable outcome of negative emotions. Now, you love this person dearly, and yet you can't seem to overcome this one particular interaction. That's because you both have a conditioned response that keeps you both locking horns and locked into that one particular exchange. Now, as much as we would like to, you can't make other people change the way they think. You can, however, take responsibility for your part of the exchange and change the way that you think and respond. And your new response will create a different reaction from the other person. So let's imagine that your conditioned response to that particular exchange with a loved one is, you keep doing this to me, you know this upsets me, I refuse to speak to you. I want you to notice how that conditioned response has a defensive quality and retracts you back into a position of self-preservation. You have withdrawn from the interaction, and whatever the topic of that interaction is, it remains unresolved. And what remains unresolved will, of course, revolve into a future similar interaction with this person. So by taking responsibility and initiative, you could break that pattern of your conditioned response by reversing it with a dynamic response like this. You keep doing this. Why does this upset you? Speak to me about it. By reverse thinking your conditioned response with that new dynamic response, you have reversed the relationship issue from being the problem that's aimed at yours truly to being an issue that you seek to understand. You have shifted from being defensive to being inquisitive. With the dynamic response, you have stopped blaming the other side and started accepting your participation, your role, your part of the communication. With the dynamic response, you are taking control and aiming to find a solution. You've transitioned from the subjective bias of, why are you doing this to me, to seeing that there is an objective problem to be resolved between the we. Now consider this next conditioned response to a situation where someone you know is trying to help you. You don't know what you're talking about. My way is much better. With that conditioned response, you have taken the higher way of, I know best and you don't. Sadly, our little ego thinks that we have all of the answers when we don't. And we're all guilty of being pig-headed and stubborn when believing that we know best and others don't. And so, the limited thinking of that conditioned response could then be reversed with the dynamic response of, I want to know more about it. How is your way better? Now we are in a position to learn and to know and to grow more. We have reversed our attitude from being stubborn to being open-minded, cooperative, and willing to consider an alternative way that could result in a more desirable outcome. Now I want you to think about a situation where you have been triggered by a strong urge for pleasurable stimulation, where the conditioned response that's going on inside your head could be as simple as, I just can't handle this anymore, I need to go and get some, and fill in the blank. Again, that is a very simple response to a trigger, and yet those words have a very powerful emotional charge, this strong compulsive urge that once you have fought the fault or spoke the words, the decision has been made and you are off to the races to get whatever pleasure it is that rocks your world. But of course, if you are attempting to quit a bad habit, be it smoking, binge drinking, junk food, whatever it is, when those thoughts, those words, that conditioned response of, I can't handle this anymore, I just need to go and get some, fill in the blank, when that conditioned response comes into your mind with its overpowering suggestion, that will result in you self-sabotaging. And this happens unconsciously without you being aware of it. Now you could reverse that conditioned response with a new dynamic response of, I don't need to get fill in the blank. What is a better way to handle this? Again, this is a very simple reversal of the words, and yet just changing those words will shift your attention and focus towards finding an alternative solution to soothe whatever stress, upset, or anxiety it is that you can't handle in the moment. Rather than talk yourself into that pleasurable treat, you are talking yourself away from it. And if you are thinking right now that these reverse thinking changes are simple or stupid even, don't. And I can't say this enough. Your thoughts really are that powerful. Your thoughts are attached to powerful emotional triggers. They are that controlling over you. What you must realize is that your thoughts are the internal stimulus that triggers you. Even when you are triggered by something or someone out there, it could be a person, place, possession, or predicament that triggers you, that external stimulus is then triggering the internal stimulus of your thinking. And it's your thinking which is deciding what experience and behavior it will go for next. Therefore, by interrupting that conditioned response with a dynamic response, you are actually implementing a seismic shift in your thinking. Therefore, by interrupting your conditioned response with a dynamic response, you are actually implementing a seismic shift in your thinking. You are interrupting the pattern. You are breaking the sequence, the link between your thoughts and actions. You are breaking the sequence between your thoughts and emotions. That's how powerful this reverse thinking technique is. Not only that, dynamic responses will always motion you towards a better outcome. They will transition you from being disempowered to empowered. They will take you from a limited perspective to an unlimited perspective, from being regressive to progressive. They have the power to take you from being out of control into being in control. When you learn to become more dynamic in a way that you respond, more positive, more engaging, more lively, and more forward thinking, you will face less undesirable outcomes in your life. So now that you know how simple it is to reverse think your conditioned responses into dynamic responses, you can start to learn and play this mind game in your life. So right now, let's do this exercise. I want you to pause the video and then write inside your journal the subtitle, "The Dynamic Response." Now refer to the conditioned responses that you have identified in the previous step, and then design your dynamic responses to reverse them. Go back over each one and reverse think them just as we discussed, just as the examples that I provided you with. Then prepare each dynamic response into a concise and memorable sentence. It's that easy. So turn off the video and do it now. Assuming that you have completed the third step, it's now time for the fourth step of this strategy, which is called future proofing. So what is future proofing and why is it important? Well, for a dynamic response to become your new conditioned response, you must condition that response into your unconscious aspect of the mind, so that when you are triggered by the usual stimulus out there, i.e. the person, the place, the possession, or the predicament, then your unconscious aspect is already pre-programmed with its dynamic response. And how do you pre-program your unconscious aspect? You simply rehearse the new dynamic response so that it is future-proofed into your psyche as a future memory that will interrupt the old conditioned response at the point of you being triggered by the usual stimulus, because practice makes mental programs. The more you go over something over and over again, it's just like learning a new subject. The more you internalize it and embody it as a part of who you are. And doing rehearsals is exactly that. Through the repetition of learning your lines, you remember them. Rehearsals are the repetitions of scripted words until they have become memorable. Memorable means me more able. The more memorable you make something, the more able you are to perform it. Therefore, by doing rehearsals, you ensure that your future performance runs smoothly. With rehearsals, you are future proofing yourself to behave a certain way at a certain time in the future. Rehearsals are done using auto-suggestion with association. And what does that actually mean? Well, with auto-suggestion, we utilize the power of thought, which could be your inward voice or speech or outward vocals, to rehearse the new dynamic response until it has been internalized within the mind body as a permanent, fluent, and effective dialogue. With association, you will use your mind to link the new dynamic response to an imagined future scenario or memory. So, using your mind's eye, you would recall the memory of a problematic situation where you have a conditioned response that leads to that undesirable outcome, and then you replay the memory but differently with the new dynamic response. Think of it as though you're recording a new memory over the recording of an old memory, but with just a different ending. You are changing the end of a memory so that it has a new dynamic response. So, in your mind's eye, you would envisage yourself arriving at the very beginning of the situation at the moment, just before the undesirable outcome plays out. Seeing what you see, hearing what you heard, feeling what you felt, and thinking what you thought. You would just let that scenario play out inside your mind's eye right to the point just before the conditioned response takes place. And then you would reverse it with the dynamic response. So instead of your usual response, you have reversed it, flipped it with the new one. And this rehearsing the new dynamic response inside your mind's eye is what rewires, recodes, and reprograms your psychology. And it really is that simple, except for you must do the work. You must go through the rehearsals, and each time you do rehearse the dynamic response, the more you will recondition your unconscious aspect with its new mental program. Now take your dynamic responses through the rehearsal process to recondition your mind body. And since you have identified 5, you have 5 different rehearsals to do. And these rehearsals will take weeks, not days, but weeks of practice until you have rewired your mind with the new dynamic response. And remember that practice with patience and perseverance is the key to success. So, rehearse this process, this technique, this mind game for at least 10 minutes and for twice a day until you have memorized your new dynamic responses, which brings us both to the 5th step of this mind game, which is to practice mindfulness. Mindfulness is the practice of being aware of your thoughts as they arise into your mind. Being mindful of what we think is to become the observer of our mind, to disengage from the mind's instructions, to engage with the mind's intentions. So rather than doing what the mind says, you are instead becoming aware of what the mind thinks. By practicing mindfulness, you observe and reflect upon how you respond to certain situations to garner the insightful realizations of, when this does or does not happen, I do this. These realizations then become your points of change. You will have established your association between the thoughts in your head and the stimulus out there. You will know the trigger points and know exactly when to intercept those conditioned responses that would otherwise lead to a negative consequence. And with becoming a master at mindfulness, it means that before you actually get to that fork in the road ahead, you already have the conscious awareness to choose a better direction. Mindfulness does increase your self-knowledge and increases the power of your conscious aspect, your self-awareness, to a higher state of authority, whereby you cultivate a higher self-mentality that asserts control over the impulsive desires of your lower self. By practicing mindfulness, you gain more insights that make you less prone to problematic situations that result in error, harm, loss, and pain. You'll be more likely to generate desirable outcomes that benefit you and those you love. You'll become more proficient at handling situations with a positive solution. Ultimately, mindfulness leads to mindlessness. And I don't mean the kind of mindlessness where you're stupid or careless. I mean that your mind is less cluttered with anxious thoughts. That's because when you have spent a period of time being mindful, you'll have learned what your behavioral patterns are and how to correct wrong action with right actions, which leads to wisdom. You have become wise, and wisdom means that you have become wise over your dominion. You will have reconditioned the unconscious aspect of your mind with a positive feedback loop that has conditioned responses that naturally cultivate positive experiences. Thus, your life becomes effortlessly good, peaceful, and virtuous. You are mindless in the sense that you are free from the neuroticism of your mind. You are free from the obsessions. You are free from the anxieties of the mind with its stinking thinking that's forever worrying over my problems. And in a state of being mindless, you get to spend more time fully awakened within the blissful experience of the present moment of now. So do carry on with the inner work that you are doing so far within these mind games, because this will be the mindfulness practice that will lead you to the mindlessness of being free. Master this reverse thinking game and you will have a great strategy to overcome that stinking thinking that leads to a life that stinks, and then find yourself in a more dynamic state of being. And I also want you to think about other undesirable outcomes that keep showing up in your life, and then use the reverse thinking game strategy to turn them around and get better results. And before I end this tutorial, I need to have a word in your ear. And please do listen. If you've gotten this far into the Mind Games program without performing a single exercise, then either you are watching these videos before implementing the exercises, not seriously committed to self-improvement, or you are delaying action. If it's the latter two, please beware, because the unconscious aspect is a sneaky little survivalist that does not like to change. You can also mistakenly believe that you've got everything zipped up And for some delusional reason that taking massive action does not apply to you, which is contrary to the sensible thinking of the most wisest, progressive and successful people, whom continually learn and practice just like they are students. For when the mind is hungry and humble, you are game for learning everything. Therefore, master the reverse thinking game. Practice until you have gained the effortless skill of reversing undesirable outcomes for the benefit of desirable outcomes in your life, where you have dynamic responses that produce dynamic results. Then it's time for you to move on to the next tutorial and the third mind game, which is called Reframe the Game. And see you over there once you're done.